The Vietnam War. There are still many truly wild things and paradoxical observations about this topic that are practically unknown to the general public. In this documentary, there won't be any boring retelling of Wikipedia or tedious historical chronology. Through little-known but astonishing facts, fateful twists, and details, you'll see things you probably never thought about before. So, let's get started, and we'll begin with this fact. In Vietnam, there wasn't a single war for everyone. There were hundreds of different wars going on, and not only were people fighting, but 9 out of 10 military personnel from non-infantry units were engaged in completely different activities. Artillerymen, except for forward observers, were exposed to much less risk than infantrymen. Here are some documentary accounts from the book by war correspondent Max Kestings. Captain Chuck Cood, a 30-year-old native of Virginia and commander of a heavy battery, found that although his men fought selflessly in heat and rain, in mud and dust, the gigantic 175mm guns required a barrel replacement after every 300 shots. The rest of the time, the main problem was boredom. I was struggling to find a way to keep them occupied and prevent them from going to nearby villages and drinking. The artillerymen participated in combat operations for only 1 year, and most of the infantry officers even less, just 6 months, after which they were transferred to quieter places. The military command insisted on longer combat deployments, but the White House was against it. Such a limitation helped to soften the political effect, but it was disastrous from a military standpoint. There were few truly experienced soldiers in the American forces, except for a handful of career servicemen. 2/3 of the servicemen who had been in Vietnam and earned the right to call themselves military veterans, as well as to wear the Vietnam Service Medal. And those who complained about their post-traumatic stress disorder were at no greater risk of being killed in combat than they were of dying from a drug overdose or a fatal illness. Most of the support, technical, and logistics personnel served on large bases. Of the Vietnamese, they only encountered laundresses and prostitutes, and of all the hardships of military service, they suffered perhaps only from the stench of aviation kerosene. American paratrooper Gin Woodley called Cam Ranh Bay the biggest surprise of my life. They surfed there, drove big cars. There were many beautiful women in fashionable clothes and men in suits. I said to myself, wow, this is something. Yeah, it's way better here than at home. Naval radar operator Dwight Braun also described something similar. Cam Ranh Bay was paradise, just as it is. I would have lived there if I had the money, for sure. I felt like a king there. During his military service, Braun gained 20 kilograms on a diet of lobsters and steaks. He spent most of his time in the computing center, editing music recordings for the captain, who in return would lend Dwight his Jeep. In the suburbs of An Huy, the 1st Cavalry Division organized its own rest and recuperation center called Sin City, where you could buy a couple of extra liters of real British Gilbey's gin for $1.65 a bottle. And for $5 to $10, you could spend the night with a prostitute who had passed a checkup at the divisional medical unit. Here are the words of the black infantryman Richard Ford about another base. I couldn't believe that Nha Trang was in Vietnam. The base had good barracks, hot water, air conditioning, and a mess hall with 3 hot meals to choose from. It felt more like a resort. Everyone played soccer and basketball, and everyone was white. That upset me the most. All these white guys were sitting it out in the rear. The Green Berets, based on Phu Quoc Island near the Mekong Delta, were water skiing and surfing in Azure Bay. Which war you ended up in was often a matter of chance. Medic Charlie Shiab arrived in Vietnam, dreaming of fighting side by side with the comrades he had bonded with during training. But as reinforcements, they were assigned to different units, where they had to serve alongside strangers. Lieutenant John Wright came out of the headquarters in Da Nang as pale as death and briefly said to his friend, "I'm finished." He was assigned to the 1st Battalion of the 9th Marine Division, which, because of its appallingly high casualties, had earned the nickname The Walking Dead. When Medic David Rogers' combat tour ended, he was transferred to a hospital in Kuti. The doctors and nurses, all officers, dined together and flirted. After the jungle, I felt like I was in another world, like in that show M.E.A. Sesh. Movies about Vietnam give a somewhat one-sided view of the war. Because of them, it seems like there's nothing more dangerous than being a Marine. Almost all of them are doomed to die sooner or later. In reality, the mortality rate among infantry wasn't that high. Slightly fewer Marines are known as tunnel rats, special forces troops whose duties included clearing out Viet Cong underground tunnels. The rats were forced to go underground into the enemy's lair with only a flashlight and a pistol, avoiding traps and mines, and facing armed enemies, scorpions, and snakes. The chances for tunnel rats to end up dead or disabled were extremely high. However, the greatest losses, not in absolute numbers but in relative terms, were suffered not by the Marines and tunnel fighters, but by the pilots of reconnaissance helicopters. Light helicopters, particularly those resembling the H-13 with a glass ball and propeller, suffered the most. The losses among them were colossal. As for the tunnels, that's a separate conversation. In 1965, the 25th Infantry Division of the United States was stationed near the village of Cu Chi, outside Saigon. Almost immediately, strange and mystical things began to happen in the American camp. Despite the reinforced perimeter security, gunshots would ring out in the tents at night, and in the morning, dead officers would be found inside. In the bushes right in the center of the camp, real shadows would flicker, firing actual shots, and then disappearing without a trace. It took about 4 months to solve the mystery. By a random turn of events, the base of the 25th Division was located directly above an underground partisan city. The partisans dug an entire network of multi-level polygonal tunnels with a total length of over 200 kilometers, with numerous camouflaged exits to the surface. There were firing positions, bunkers, underground workshops, warehouses, and barracks above, all densely covered with mines and traps. The Vietnamese, in order to save effort and time, dug the tunnels not very deep. However, the calculations were so precise that even if tanks and heavy armored vehicles passed over them, or if artillery shells and bomb strikes hit, the tunnels would not collapse, and they continued to faithfully serve their creators. To this day, multi-level underground chambers equipped with secret hatches that close off the passages between floors have been preserved in their original form. In the tunnel system, in some places, special plugs have been installed, designed to block the enemy's path or to stop the penetration of poisonous gases. Throughout the underground complex, there are skillfully concealed ventilation hatches that open to the surface through numerous inconspicuous openings. In addition, some of the passages at that time could serve perfectly as fortified firing points, which, of course, was always a big surprise for the enemy. And even this was not enough for the Vietnamese. The tunnels and the approaches to them were equipped with a large number of ingenious deadly traps and masterfully camouflaged pitfall traps. At the entrances and exits, for greater safety, anti-personnel and anti-tank mines were installed. Often during wartime, entire villages lived in the tunnels, and this allowed the Vietnamese to save many lives. Here there were both weapons and food warehouses, smokeless kitchens, hospitals for the wounded, as well as living quarters, field headquarters, and shelters for women, the elderly, and children. Even during wartime, the Vietnamese did not forget about culture and education. In the large underground rooms, school classes were held, and films and theatrical performances were also shown there. But despite all this, the entire underground world was carefully hidden and camouflaged. One of the headquarters was even located in a captured American M48 tank. It was placed in a pit and buried. The tank had working radio communications and electricity. A 3-level system of tunnels, secretly carved out in hard clay soil with primitive tools, was built by groups of 3 or 4 people. One would dig, one would drag the earth from the tunnel to a vertical shaft, and one would lift it up and carry it away, hiding it under leaves or dumping it into the river. Interestingly, in the modern world, thanks to YouTube, these skills have turned into something that amazes the imagination. A show about building entire mansions, water parks, and underground houses with pools using only primitive hand tools. So, next time you watch two slim, dark-skinned men of Asian appearance building a villa with a pool in the jungle using only sticks and other primitive tools, remember that once, this wasn't just for entertaining a YouTube audience, but for survival and war. Since numerous shellings and bombings did not bring the desired result, the Americans eventually had to go underground themselves. They recruited short, skinny, desperate guys as tunnel rats, ready to crawl into the unknown with just a pistol, where they would be met by suffocating tightness, darkness, mines, traps, poisonous snakes, scorpions, and after all that, if they were really lucky, partisans. Traps, of course, were not only in the tunnels. It was the Vietnamese mechanisms that were the real prototypes for scenes in movies where deadly, camouflaged spikes await unsuspecting villains. One of the simplest, yet at the same time one of the hardest traps to detect, was the so-called bamboo cartridge. In the ground, where there was a lot of tall grass, a bamboo stalk was buried, inside which a cartridge, or even a large-caliber shell, was placed. The tip of the cartridge slightly protruded from the tree trunk that was buried in the ground. When a soldier stepped on the trap, the cartridge was pushed down, and a special nail struck the primer of the cartridge, causing it to fire. Most often, such traps would injure the legs or the groin. Another simple, yet no less effective trap was the bucket trap. It was an ordinary metal bucket with large fishing hooks or stakes firmly fixed inside, angled downward. The bucket was buried in the ground and carefully camouflaged. A soldier who stepped into such a trap was unable to pull his leg back out. The only thing a soldier could do in such a situation was to stand still and call for help. The comrades who arrived in such a situation were forced to dig out the bucket and, with the bucket still on his leg, take the soldier to the hospital. But perhaps the most famous of the traps used by the Vietnamese were the so-called punji sticks, which, according to experts, accounted for 2% of the wounds suffered by American soldiers. Most often, they were made from bamboo stalks, but metal punji sticks were also encountered. They came in various lengths and widths, with one end sharpened to injure the victim. Often, the sharpened tips were coated with plant or corpse poison to inflict as much damage as possible on the enemy. Such stakes were placed in camouflaged pits that were dug in areas where United States military personnel were likely to move. The point of penetration was usually in the shin area. Sometimes the stakes were set at a downward angle. As a result, a soldier who fell into such a trap had no chance of getting out on his own and was forced to call for help. The cautious Vietnamese partisans would dig several such pits next to each other so that comrades who rushed to help after hearing cries for help would end up in the neighboring pits. There were also more advanced traps of this type, which were two-level pits with stakes. Falling down to the bottom of the pit, which was lined with punji sticks, the soldier would brush against the edges of other shields that also covered the pit from above. As a result, the soldier was impaled both from above and below. The punji sticks were covered by a lid that could freely rotate 180 degrees. After catching a victim, it would always return to a horizontal position and wait for a new victim. To make the trap less noticeable, it was carefully camouflaged. There were also huge spherical structures that resembled giant maces. Stones with bamboo or metal spikes embedded in them, coated with poison, were hung on lianas in the jungle. When triggered, this large spiked ball would fall from the tree, sweeping away everything in its path. In the impenetrable jungles, Vietnamese partisans also used a whip trap. For this, a bamboo trunk was bent, with a shield mounted at the end, which had sharpened sticks on its tips, and it was connected to a tripwire. When triggered, there was a sharp strike with the stakes. A similar but smaller trap was the bamboodzi trap, which was set in a doorway. It was enough to open the door, and a small log studded with stakes would fly out towards you. Traps of this type were often set so that the blow would land directly on the head. When triggered, such a trap would inflict serious injuries, sometimes with fatal consequences. In addition to the above, Vietnamese partisans invented traps in which the main striking element was poisonous snakes. Most often in such cases, the bamboo viper was used. This snake is also called the three-step snake because its venom acts almost instantly. The bamboo viper is small in size, which made it easy to tie it with fishing line to branches at head level. The partisans put this snake everywhere they could: in bags, empty bamboo stems, boxes, and they also scattered them around on the trails where American soldiers walked, in underground tunnels. Leskoy's kufia was tied to the ceiling, and if an American soldier didn't notice it in time, the enraged snake would immediately bite the uninvited guest. However, the most common trap in the Vietnam War was the simple tripwire. But the Vietnamese wouldn't be Vietnamese if they didn't improve this type of weapon for themselves. A hollow bamboo stem filled with a mixture of saltpeter and diesel fuel was mounted under a grenade or other munitions. Such a design significantly increased the destructive effect. An even simpler trap than a tripwire was also invented in Vietnam. It was called ananas. Its essence was as follows. Grenades or other explosive devices were hung on tree branches. To trigger the trap, it was enough just to touch the branches. Since combat was often conducted in the jungle, ananas traps were used frequently. War life was dangerous but full of exotic experiences. The Spetsnaz Team A, which was based near the Cambodian border, used elephants for transporting cargo. The animals' backs were covered with star-spangled flags, which served as identification marks for American aviation. There was also another kind of exoticism, an inhuman one. The American Special Forces Unit Tiger specialized in fighting against partisans. Any methods were used, even the dirtiest and most brutal ones. In 2003, correspondent Michael Salla published previously classified data from the time of the Vietnam War. The United States Army conducted its own investigation into the war crimes of the Tiger Unit and concluded that most of the rumors about it were true. The Tiger fighters cut off the ears of partisans and made necklaces out of them. They tortured detainees and destroyed civilians to intimidate others. Local residents were used for demining minefields, being forced to run across them at gunpoint. Michael Sally's investigation led to a strong public outcry even decades later. However, in the end, no one was punished. In the tribunal's conclusions, they spoke about the unit as a whole. Specific names were never mentioned. Another unpleasant fact about that war is the origin of the word frag. Today's schoolchildren who use the word frag probably have no idea how grim its history is. It's an abbreviation of the phrase fragmentation grenade. Over time, that's exactly how they started referring to the killing of one's own commander during the Vietnam War. There are at least 230 documented cases of officers being killed by their own soldiers, and 1,400 cases of officer deaths that have no satisfactory explanation. However, researchers and Vietnam War veterans believe that this is just the tip of the iceberg, and most likely, thousands of similar attacks remained unknown and unsolved, and the number of undocumented cases was at least 5,000. Narcotics and alcohol, as a rule, played a decisive role in the commission of the crime. In the early years of the Vietnam War, American enlisted personnel could easily buy marijuana, amphetamines, opium, barbiturates, and hallucinogens. In 1969, the leading position was taken by cheap and extremely fast-acting heroin, which was even cheaper than marijuana. As a result, in 1971, about 60,000 servicemen in Vietnam were officially recognized as heroin addicts. Every year, dozens of them died from overdoses. The scale of the problem is well illustrated by the data from 1971, when the number of soldiers hospitalized due to combat injuries was less than 5,000, while more than 20,000 were hospitalized due to drug abuse. There is even such a curious fact. Sergeant Peter Lemon received a medal for bravery after performing an amazing feat. Peter held off 2 waves of attacks, firing back with a grenade launcher and machine guns, and when those were out of action, with his personal rifle. He threw grenades at the enemy, was wounded 3 times, carried a wounded comrade out of the line of fire, and in the end ran to finish off the enemy in hand-to-hand combat. The sergeant's feat became widely known and was widely covered in the media. However, Lemon's admission was a blow to the Army's prestige. At the moment of the attack, he and his comrades had smoked so much cannabis that they could barely understand what was happening. Peter told journalists he considers America an aggressor and observed that 90% of all American privates in Vietnam smoke marijuana. But let's get back to fragging. Another important reason for its spread was the noticeable decline in the quality of American Armed Forces draftees, which took place from 1966 to 1973. This is linked to the initiative of United States President Lyndon Johnson and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who, fearing the discontent of middle-class voters, allowed college students to receive deferments or serve in the reserves and the National Guard. As a result, the shortage of draftees in the active forces was made up by people from poor segments of society and the working class. In 1966, the shortage of personnel became especially acute, and McNamara launched the controversial Project 100,000, which was presented to the public as a social correction law. Within its framework, over 5 years, 345,000 people with low levels of education were drafted into the military. Having gained the informal nickname McNamara's Morons in American society, people from the Moron Corps were seen as trouble-free cannon fodder, relieving the political stress associated with mobilizing students, the hassle of granting deferments, or calling up reservists. Among them, there was a high number of cases of desertion, disobedience to orders, attacks on fellow soldiers, and other military crimes. Nevertheless, initially, they helped temporarily alleviate the severe personnel shortage. However, in the years 68 to 69, due to the loss of 28,000 people killed and tens of thousands wounded, their number turned out to be insufficient, and the Pentagon again lowered the requirements for the draft contingent. As a result, criminals, drug addicts, and the mentally ill poured into the Army, who among professional soldiers evoked nothing but contempt. For example, the Commandant of the United States Marine Corps, Lewis Wilson, did not hesitate to call them the scum of society. And General William Westmoreland was horrified by the presence in the ranks of the armed forces in the last years of the Vietnam War of these feeble-minded, criminal, and unprepared people. McNamara is actually a very interesting historical figure. He was an economist and a mathematical wunderkind, and he thought in terms of numbers and quantities. Under several United States presidents, as Secretary of Defense, he became one of the architects of military strategy in the Vietnam War, proposing several megaprojects designed for a confident victory. But the projects ended in failure. McNamara survived an assassination attempt, becoming a symbol of a senseless, inhuman war. Another failed project of this technocrat was the McNamara Line. It was an electronic barrier 160 miles long across Vietnam, from the Laotian border to the sea, conceived by the head of the Pentagon to contain the infiltration of troops into South Vietnam from the north. But mathematical calculations and thousands of electronic sensors in the jungle were not enough to stop barefoot Vietnamese soldiers and rusty, battered trucks carrying ammunition. And the local peasants put the electronic marvel to more useful, in their view, purposes, making bags, sandals, fishing gear, and other everyday items, for which they used wires taken from the McNamara Line. But the supply routes from North Vietnam to the south could not be neutralized. This route was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was crucial for North Vietnam's victory. During the Vietnam War, it was used to transport weapons, ammunition, and fuel into South Vietnam. Of course, it's not just a trail. This is a network of land and water routes over 20,000 kilometers long, stretching across the territories of Cambodia and Laos. By the way, this name has American origins, while the Vietnamese themselves called this area the Chong Son Trail, after the name of the mountain range. The Americans named the system of routes after the first president of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the ideologist and founder of the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam. It was this communist organization, led by Ho Chi Minh, that started the uprising against the country's president and began the Long War in 1957. A guerrilla war broke out in the territory of South Vietnam, started by insurgents against the elected president Ngo Dinh Diem. Almost 2 years after the start of armed clashes, the authorities of North Vietnam decided to support the insurgents. For this purpose, an armed transport unit was assembled, tasked with organizing the uninterrupted supply of military equipment to South Vietnam. The first transport corridor was laid through the demilitarized zone between the North and the South, but it was soon discovered and destroyed. The new route, which later became known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, bypassed the demilitarized zone and entered the territory of Laos. At that time, a civil war was raging in Laos. The border areas were controlled by Laotian communists, who sympathized with the South Vietnamese insurgents and did not hinder the passage of transport through their territory. The second country through which the trail partially passed was Cambodia. Officially, it declared neutrality, but it granted broad authority to the North Vietnamese army and allowed them to use its territory. During the war, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was continuously expanded, and as a result, it turned into a branched network of several major roads and narrow paths running parallel to each other. Along the entire length, relay stations were built where soldiers of the transport units could rest. Most of the route passed through forests and jungles, so it remained completely invisible from the air. All facilities were meticulously camouflaged, and the road was protected by an air defense system with large-caliber anti-aircraft machine guns. At first, porters on foot and elephants were used to transport cargo, but soon they were replaced by trucks. In the northern regions of South Vietnam, the landscape is mostly mountainous, so there were not many convenient places for the pipeline to exit. Major battles constantly took place at these points. Cambodia and Laos formally maintained neutrality, so American troops could not cross their borders and destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail. For secret operations in the neutral zone, a special unit was created that conducted reconnaissance, placed motion sensors, engaged in sabotage, and captured prisoners. In 1964, the United States military received permission to conduct combat operations on the territory of Laos. The trail was regularly bombed, and attempts were made to wash it away using climate weapons. The North Vietnamese army suffered colossal losses, but the Americans were never able to completely cut off this artery. Both the Americans and the Vietnamese agree that the Ho Chi Minh Trail played a decisive role in North Vietnam's victory. Researchers confirm that since 1968, the military strength of the South Vietnamese insurgents relied exclusively on supplies from the northern part of the country. The regular army of the North fought all the major battles, and both military equipment and soldiers arrived in the southern regions directly via the trail. If the opposing side had managed to cut off this corridor, the outcome of the war could have been completely different. After the departure of the American military, the trail was rebuilt and improved in 1975, turning into a wide, all-weather road, almost 8 meters wide. An oil pipeline about 2,000 kilometers long and a telecommunications line were also built here. And there was also a whole army of propagandists in that war. From the very beginning of the operation, the propaganda staff in the ground forces alone numbered more than 1,000 people, 118 of whom were fluent in Vietnamese, 118 of whom were fluent in Vietnamese. After the war in Korea, the Americans organized a system of psychological pressure in Vietnam on an even larger scale. In total, more than 50 billion leaflets were dropped, which is about 1,500 leaflets for every resident of both South and North Vietnam. Here, no one was trying to convince the communists that their path was utopian anymore. In order to sow panic and despair in the hearts of the residents of Hanoi, the neighboring city of Phu Ly, along with all its inhabitants, was wiped off the face of the earth by American bombers. For psychological impact, the Americans widely used weapons that caused severe bodily injuries, intense pain, and shock, in particular napalm, cluster bombs, and flechette-killing elements. In addition, aviation sprayed herbicides and other toxic chemicals over the jungles of Vietnam to destroy vegetation and all living things in the jungles. The soil and vegetation in the areas where spraying occurred still contain elevated concentrations of substances harmful to human health. In radio broadcasts and leaflets, the Americans tried to intimidate the population with new, more intensive air raids. The tactic of advance warning about upcoming bombings was widely used. This tactic was especially effective in areas adjacent to destroyed villages and cities, since their residents could see the results of the bombings for themselves. During the period of active combat in Indochina, aviation alone dropped about 8 million tons of bombs, almost 3 times more than American aviation dropped on all fronts during World War II. For the first time, American propagandists made such extensive use of the enemy's mythology in their radio broadcasts and oral messages. They broadcast screams of terror, desperate cries of women and children, Buddhist funeral music, and tape recordings of wild animal roars, which were meant to represent the voices of forest spirits and demons. On the night before their offensive, the command of the STO's 1st Brigade, 1st Airborne Division, organized broadcasts over areas with concentrated enemy forces. Broadcasts of a recorded piercing eagle's cry, which was the emblem of the STO 1st Airborne Division, mixed with children's voices saying, "Papa, come home." At the same time, leaflets were dropped from airplanes showing an eagle holding a Viet Cong soldier in its claws. On the backside of the leaflet was the following text: "Beware, Viet Cong. There is no safe place for you to run, no shelter where you can hide. The eagle will catch up with you at any time, in any place. Without warning, it brings inevitable death." They also prepared an address to wandering souls for the superstitious Vietnamese. The Americans studied their folk beliefs, according to which those killed in battle must be buried in the land of their ancestors. And if this does not happen, the souls will wander the earth, which according to Vietnamese customs is unacceptable. Tape recorders with timers were dropped on parachutes around the perimeter of the village, which would periodically turn on and off throughout the night. With the beginning of the use of cries from the sky, the number of defectors increased more than threefold. It seems like a lot until you see the actual numbers, from 120 to 380 people per month. There was also souvenir propaganda. Packages with cigarettes, chewing gum, toothpaste, toys, rice, or money were dropped over the territory of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The gifts had short, catchy notes, from America's children to North Vietnam's children. In the first 14 months of the war, 8 million vitamin tablets, 29,000 toothbrushes, combs, and pencils, worth a total of $4 million, were distributed among the population of Vietnam. Cash rewards were given for surrendered weapons, intelligence information, and for delivering defectors, $24 for a soldier and $2,100 for a political commissar. Both sides also used the theme of female attention in visual propaganda. A typical example of such material is a color photograph of a beautiful Vietnamese girl with a rhymed caption, "I am a village girl. If you become a Viet Cong, I will never love you." Was there any result from all directions of this propaganda? It is believed that during the period of hostilities, about 250,000 Vietnamese voluntarily switched to the enemy's side. According to meticulous specialists' calculations, the American Army's expenses to kill one Vietnamese averaged $100,000. At the same time, to persuade him to switch to the United States side cost $125. Among such dollar calculations, there are others too. For example, after the fall of Saigon in 1975, American forces organized a large-scale evacuation of the remaining troops and allied Vietnamese. The operation was called Frequent Wind, and during it, 7,000 people were evacuated in just one day. However, everything was carried out in such a rush that there was a catastrophic shortage of space on the deck. As a result, refugees were preferred over helicopters, which were pushed off the deck to make room. The footage of helicopters being thrown overboard from the aircraft carrier became the most famous symbol of defeat in the Vietnam War. The value of the machines that went to the bottom is estimated at $10 million at the exchange rate of those years. Adjusted for inflation, in today's money, that's about $50 million. Another tragic evacuation operation concerns children. The baby lift operation was intended to save orphans, but it turned into a real catastrophe. On April 3rd, United States President Gerald Ford ordered the United States Air Force to evacuate 2,000 children born from relationships between American soldiers and Vietnamese women, who had lost both parents or had been abandoned by their parents. To avoid panic, the evacuation was first carried out to neighboring countries that were loyal to the American regime. Military transport aircraft C-5 were used to evacuate the children. The very first flight from Saigon crashed just a few minutes after takeoff, claiming the lives of 155 people, most of whom were children. But despite the tragedy, the operation continued. At the height of the war in Vietnam, volunteers were taking orphaned children, including infants, and placing them on airplanes. The smallest ones were placed in cardboard boxes, which were strapped to the seats. As part of Operation Baby Lift in April 1975, more than 3,300 infants and children were evacuated from Saigon to the United States, Australia, France, and Canada. Only a few of them were actually orphans. The rest never saw their real parents again. The thing is, in Vietnam, poor families would place their children in orphanages simply because they couldn't afford to feed them. In such cases, the parents didn't intend to give up their children and often visited them. In some cases, parents tried to get their children onto the baby lift flights and then leave Vietnam themselves as refugees, hoping to find their children later. In the end, only 12 children out of more than 3,300 were reunited with their Vietnamese parents. But this was preceded by lengthy and sometimes years-long court proceedings. The main obstacle to reuniting parents with their biological children was the lack of any records or data about the children who had been evacuated from Vietnam. Mobilization, draft dodgers, deserters, conflict between fathers and children, true patriots and vicious traitors. Let's take a look at how all this looked in American historical settings more than half a century ago. More than 2.5 million Americans took part in the Vietnam War. Of them, more than 58,000 people died, and hundreds of thousands returned with injuries and trauma. The longer the conflict in Vietnam lasted, the less support it received among the United States population, and the larger the anti-war movement became. When, on April 28, 1967, a draft board employee in Houston, Texas, called out the name Cassius Clay several times, no one responded. The man known worldwide as Muhammad Ali showed not the slightest desire to step forward for a medical examination and induction into the United States Army. The officer warned the undisputed world heavyweight champion that he was committing a criminal offense and threatened him with prosecution. Ali replied that he understood the seriousness of the situation, but still did not want to take part in the draft. A few minutes later, the popular athlete stepped out onto the street, squinting slightly at the camera flashes, and addressed the reporters who had gathered around him. My conscience and personal conviction, as a devout Muslim, compel me to express my position by refusing to be enlisted in the army. I realized that if I went there, I would not be able to remain a sincere follower of my religion. Later that same day, the sports commissions of several states stripped Ali of his professional license even before he was officially recognized as a draft dodger. And in the following months, the boxer became one of the most hated public figures in the country. Politicians, journalists, and ordinary Americans accused him of being unwilling to fulfill his duty to his country and lacking patriotism. However, Ali did not take back his words even after he became a national outcast. 3 months after the incident at the draft board, Muhammad Ali was found guilty of refusing to comply with the lawful order to register for military service. The boxer filed an appeal, but the United States Supreme Court overturned his sentence only 2 years later, in June of '71. Muhammad Ali is just one prominent name from a long list of those who refused to serve in Vietnam. The boxer thus expressed his political and ideological stance. For many other Americans, the unwillingness to go to war was connected not only with moral or religious beliefs, but also with fear for their own lives. Thousands of young people did not want to die or kill for populist slogans they did not support. Draft dodgers came up with various ways to avoid being sent to the front, from faking mental illnesses to fleeing to Canada. Here are the words of one of the draft dodgers, John Lacey. "Was I a coward? Did I let my country down? In a sense, you could have called me a coward. Because I chose to leave rather than sit in prison for refusing to serve, Lacey reasoned, but I wasn't afraid to fight. I refused to serve in Vietnam because we had no right to be there. We only brought suffering and destruction to that country. We acted like bullies and used all our military might against nations and peasants. Someone might say that I'm not in a position to judge what happened in Vietnam. However, many veterans who fought there hated the war no less than I did. I was deeply troubled by the actions of the government. The authorities lied to justify their actions and spent millions on bombings. While the problems in our cities were getting worse, the Vietnam War left a deep scar on my country. John Lacey was born in 1945 and grew up in New York. And in 1967, right after finishing college, he left the United States for Canada to avoid the draft. After some time, he moved to Sweden and only returned from there in 1977. When President Jimmy Carter pardoned all the draftees who had been accused of desertion and draft evasion during the Vietnam War. The harder things got for Americans in Vietnam, the more actively and joyfully Canadians welcomed draft dodgers. Newspapers wrote about them and their stories were told on television. The fugitives from the States and the Canadians who welcomed them agreed that they considered the war immoral, and that refusing to participate in it was a moral necessity. However, the relationships between Americans hiding from the draft and the Canadians who welcomed them were far from always ideal. Here are some examples of such quotes. "I don't like draft dodgers, and I'll do everything possible within the law to get rid of them," said Vancouver Mayor Tom Campbell. Toronto Mayor William Dennison agreed. "Hippies and deserters are our only problem." However, in many ways, it was precisely this kind of radical stance by officials that forced the authorities to take a clear position on the issue of immigrants from the States. May 22, 1969, Canada's Minister of Manpower and Immigration, Alan McKitchen, announced that Americans who opposed the war and the draft would be granted residency. Before this, the legal status of draft dodgers in a foreign country remained unclear. Some of them were lucky, while others were turned back at the border and sent back to the States. The change in the situation was brought about by the position of several respectable parliamentarians who believed that Canada would be acting slavishly if it refused to admit American deserters out of fear of worsening relations with its neighbors. In the following decades, the Americans who settled in Canada formed the foundation of various political and social movements. Some were so eager to assimilate with the local population that they themselves advocated nationalist ideas. Canadians in the 1970s often noted that the most radical chauvinists usually had American origins. This tendency was explained by the desire of foreigners to integrate into society and by a sense of gratitude to the country that sheltered them during a period of estrangement from their homeland. Americans in Canada actively raised issues of ecology and global warming, advocated for the abandonment of nuclear weapons as early as the 21st century, supported modern conscientious objectors, and criticized the governments of various countries for new wars. If in the United States, in response to the leftist movement of the 60s, the conservative wing became more radicalized and strengthened, then in Canada, pacifists and supporters of humanistic values felt freer. A major contribution to the liberalization of Canada's domestic policy was made specifically by immigrants who fled from the Vietnam War and protested against it. What happened in Vietnam at the end of the 60s provoked large-scale rallies not only in the United States and Canada, but also in Japan. There, one of the forms of protest against violence was helping American soldiers who wanted to avoid being sent to the front. Most of these soldiers tried to find roundabout ways to get to Sweden, the only European country not belonging to the socialist bloc, which agreed to grant deserters humanitarian asylum. According to the United States Department of Defense, between July 1, 1966 and December 31, 1973, 503,026 soldiers refused to fulfill their military duty. A huge number compared to 50,000 people during World War II and 13,790 people in the Korean War, which ended in 1953. Most of this 500,000 draft dodgers went into hiding in America. while far fewer soldiers deserted directly in Vietnam or in other Asian regions. Among the latter, Japan stood out in particular, since more than 10 American military bases operated in this country, from which conscripts deserted. However, the immigration laws in the country did not allow them to apply for asylum. Moreover, after they left the unit to which they were assigned, local police had the right to arrest them for illegal stay on Japanese territory. And yet, some deserters managed to achieve their goal. They either stayed in Japan and went into hiding, or escaped from the country on their own using forged documents. In the fall of '67, Japanese activists from the anti-war movement called the Civil League for Peace in Vietnam began to come to the aid of American soldiers. This organization specialized in various forms of protest, from sit-in strikes in front of the American government in Tokyo to developing secret routes that would allow foreign soldiers to disappear from the view of local authorities and their own command. On the 23rd of October, the headquarters of this league in the capital received information about 4 American sailors who had gone absent without leave when their aircraft carrier docked in the port of Yokosuka. 5 days later, Japanese pacifists sheltered the deserters, and 2 weeks after that, they transported them to Yokohama and brought them aboard a Soviet ship bound for the city of Nakotka. After the sailors' escape, their statement was published, in which the young men spoke out against what was happening in Vietnam and criticized the United States authorities for increasing military power in Asia. The deserters, the oldest of whom was 20 years old, were called the Fearless Four. The Soviet authorities, who had previously guaranteed the Japanese pacifists humane treatment of the fugitives, fulfilled their obligations and released the sailors to Europe. A couple of months after the escape, the Fearless Four arrived in Sweden. Over the next year, the League members perfected the system and helped several dozen more deserters first get to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and then to Sweden. One of the reasons that prevented Japanese pacifists from helping more deserters was the caution of the Soviet Union. The authorities of the country were afraid that a spy might infiltrate the group of deserters. The route was indeed compromised by an American agent operating undercover. While searching for new underground routes, the soldier had to hide from other American military personnel and Japanese authorities for a long time. This led to the organization effectively freezing its activities. However, it was by no means the only force in Japan that opposed a military conflict involving the United States on its continent. On October 21st, 1968 activists declared it an International Anti-War Day and held protest actions across the country. They reached a climax when students blocked Tokyo Station with a train loaded with aviation fuel, ready to be delivered to the American base in Yokohama. In total, about 700 people were detained in the capital and its surroundings that day for participating in unauthorized rallies. The mass arrests sparked new protests around the world. In France, President Charles de Gaulle even threatened striking workers with martial law. In Japan, students blocked universities until the beginning of '69, when police and helicopters bombarded protesters with tear gas grenades. In the clashes, 270 students and 710 representatives of the authorities were injured, and 400 civilians were arrested. The generation gap is another deep problem of American society at that time, which was aggravated by the war, pacifism, and hatred toward the American government. Their parents considered the young people's actions to be naive rebellion. Young Americans who did not leave the country and protested against the war in Vietnam were harshly criticized by conservative politicians and public figures. Supporters of the Asian campaign considered themselves true patriots and fighters against communism, while they saw their ideological opponents as ungrateful traitors. Among some military personnel, the theory of a stab in the back was spreading. They attributed the failures of the American Army not to enemy resistance, but to sabotage and desertion by the Fifth Column. So, parallel to the Vietnam War, another war unfolded in America, between young people and the old men who run this country. In addition to numerous celebrities, from Muhammad Ali to musician Bob Dylan, thousands of young Americans declared their disagreement with the actions of the authorities. For the generation that lived through World War II and often considered frontline experience the main criterion of manliness, They remained, one could say, just troublemakers influenced by Soviet propaganda, even foreign agents. Some conscripts went on the run and hid from mobilization in remote areas, while others openly protested against the state-sanctioned military aggression, even if such behavior threatened them with prison sentences or being sent to the front. In '64, the first mass burning of draft cards took place, and in '67, activist David Harris inspired like-minded people to send their draft notices back to the draft board with letters explaining that young Americans did not want to participate in violence. "Some called me a draft dodger, but I wasn't dodging anything," explained Harris. "I wasn't avoiding the consequences. In response to the truth I spoke, I was ordered to report to the military unit. Using bureaucratic nuances to delay this visit, I helped found the resistance movement, which organized acts of civil disobedience. We lived in a car, traveled from campus to campus, gave speeches, and looked for people who were outraged by the evil that had engulfed our nation." Harris's group consulted everyone on draft issues, regardless of whether they planned to evade conscription or report as ordered. Activists handed out leaflets in front of military enlistment offices and urged the young people who came there to go home, hid draft dodgers, and stole archives with personal data. In January '68, Harris was arrested for refusing to comply with the requirements under the military service law. And at the hearing several months later, the judge refused to admit the defendant's statement about why the war contradicted his moral principles into the case. Harris was one of 3,250 Americans who were sentenced to actual prison terms for refusing to serve in Vietnam. Muhammad Ali, who remained free during the appeal of his case, although he could not participate in professional boxing, also became one of the unofficial leaders of the anti-war movement. The athlete traveled around the country and told students why he decided to refuse service, despite accusations and persecution. "Some considered me a hero," Ali recalled. "Some said that I was acting wrongly, but everything I did according to my conscience. I wasn't trying to be a leader, I just wanted to preserve my freedom. I spoke on behalf of all people, not just black people, about the need to think about our actions. The government developed a system where the son of a wealthy man goes to college and gets a deferment, while the son of a poor man is sent to war. After graduating from college, the wealthy man's son would find other ways to extend his deferment until he was too old to be drafted into the army. Among the draftees, there were many who did not publicly oppose the war, but tried to be declared unfit for service. Some young people claimed to have holy thoughts or pretended to have mental disorders. Others refused to eat for several days and turned into living skeletons covered in skin, for the coveted mark in their file. One draft dodger went into the mountains and lived as a hermit in a treehouse for 6 years. The northeastern region of New England was nicknamed Little Canada because of how many young people hid from the army in the local dense forests. In 1973, the army switched to a contract basis. In 1974, President Ford announced a partial amnesty for draft dodgers, and in 1975, the war ended. However, even in the mid-1970s, many conservative Americans condemned the war not because it was immoral and destroyed thousands of their fellow citizens' lives, but because their government proved unable to win. Most citizens stopped supporting the war, not because they realized it was a mistake, but because the whole endeavor turned out to be a hopeless failure. One way or another, in the public consciousness, the Vietnam War turned from an ideological struggle for the future of humanity into a tragedy for different nations and individual people. And draft dodgers went from being seen as cowards to people who found the strength to stand up to a state that had chosen the path of violence. Anti-war ideas were discussed even before the war, and with the start of the draft, they grew stronger and formed into a full-fledged movement. Celebrities, students, veteran hippies, participants in the civil rights movement, feminists, religious organizations, the labor movement, and many others were involved in anti-war protests in America. After the bombings of North Vietnam in 1965, teachers and students at American universities began holding anti-war seminars instead of regular scheduled classes. The peace movement soon spilled out onto the streets. In 1966, the leading anti-war activists formed the National Mobilization Committee to end the war in Vietnam. It was this committee that became the organizer of the March on the Pentagon. This protest, which took place 55 years ago, became a kind of culmination of nationwide protests against the war in Vietnam. About 100,000 people participated in the demonstration that took place in Washington. Here, for example, is the famous photograph known as Flower Power. Protester George Harris is placing a carnation into the barrel of a rifle. It was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize in 1967. From the recollections of one of the rally organizers, Bill Zimmerman, we had been protesting for 3 years and often felt disappointed because we had no influence on politics. It was clear that we were being ignored. As soon as the war escalated, we felt that we had to intensify our protest. A rally was held at the Lincoln Memorial, where prominent figures of the anti-war movement, musicians, and artists spoke. The Washington Post reported on the demonstration's participants. There were hippies and housewives, veterans and aging pacifists, but the overwhelming majority were college students or high school seniors. After the rally at the Lincoln Memorial, a crowd of between 30 and 50,000 people moved toward the headquarters of the United States Department of Defense, where they were met by soldiers of the 82 and Airborne Division. From the recollections of Bill Zimmerman, when I saw this, I was thrilled. I realized that we had managed to move from protest to resistance. It was probably the first case in the world, except perhaps for Gandhi in India, when 50,000 people were ready to commit civil disobedience. The protesters did not have a unified plan of action. Of course, unless you count wild and extravagant ideas as plans. One of the movement's inspirers, Ebby Hoffman, energizing the crowd and like-minded people, spoke about the intention to lift the Pentagon 300 feet into the air using combined psychic energy, and to keep it there until the war in Vietnam is over. His associate Allen Ginsberg led Tibetan chants, and the artist Michael Bowen brought 200 pounds of flowers and handed them out to the crowd. Some speakers attributed occult significance to the Pentagon because of the building's architectural resemblance to a pentagram, calling for the expulsion of evil forces from it. The diagonals of the Pentagon form a pentagram, and the intersection points of the diagonals in a regular pentagon are points of the golden ratio. The Pentagon seems to consist of an infinite number of smaller pentagons, which are formed by the intersection points of the diagonals. By the way, a regular pentagon with a pentagram inscribed in it is a symbol of the sacred union of Pythagoras. Some researchers suggest that the Pentagon is only the visible part of a decahedron, hidden beneath the Earth. However, technically implementing such a project would most likely be impossible. By the way, Platon considered this geometric shape to be ideal. The great philosopher claimed that it was precisely this shape that his god used as a model to create the universe. But we'll discuss this building later. For now, let's return to the protests. Thousands of protesters sat on the grass or on the sidewalk right in front of the soldiers, who had formed a human barricade blocking the entrance to the Pentagon. The most radical protesters tore down the temporary fence and tried to break into the building. A group of about 10 people managed to do this, but they were immediately detained by the soldiers. During the unrest, some demonstrators threw bottles and stones at the soldiers and shot at them with water pistols. To repel them, at some point tear gas was used. The confrontation continued throughout the evening and night. During the protest, 647 people were detained by the police. The March on the Pentagon became a transition from scattered anti-war protests to mass resistance. 2 years later, 500,000 people protested in Washington in 1971. In response to the United States invasion of Cambodia, 4 million high school and college students went on strike, and more than 800 educational institutions across the country were closed simultaneously. Some of the protests were inevitably accompanied by violence. In the first half of 1969, 29 protesting students were killed by police, guards, and vigilantes. There were 8 cases of public self-immolation and 84 anti-war bombings and arson attacks. Another anti-war movement in the United States was Veterans Against the War. It appeared in 1967. These were people who returned after military actions in Southeast Asia. In 1971, veterans appeared in Washington to hold a protest action that lasted for 6 days. For this, Nixon stripped them of their veteran status. Law enforcement agencies arrested 100 people, but 1,000 new protesters came to take their place. They marched to the Capitol. The culmination of this action was when they collectively threw thousands of their medals into the building. This was a message to the government that had sent them to die in another country for the illusory interests of the United States. The protest was unprecedented. In conclusion, it should be noted that the result of all these protests was more than tangible. The growing power of the anti-war movement was one of the main reasons that forced the United States leadership to stop military actions in Vietnam and enter into negotiations. There were, of course, other reasons. Of course, the superpower failed to defeat the country. The former colony was not defeated because the Viet Cong was so strong in spirit. From 1961 to 1965, the Soviet Union provided Vietnam with 130 artillery pieces and mortars, 1,400 machine guns, and 54,000 units of small arms. And later, the Vietnamese People's Army received much more impressive toys: MiG-17 and MiG-21 fighter jets, Il-28 bombers, T-54 tanks, and Davina anti-aircraft missile systems. However, this support was costly for the Soviet economy. Kosygin believed that aid to Vietnam was costing 1.5 million rubles a day, at a time when the dollar was worth less than the ruble. And of course, military specialists. How many were there in total? There is an answer. According to the data from the Operations Directorate of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, there were more than 6,000 officers and 4,500 sergeants and enlisted men, a total of just over 10,000 people. Military specialists did not run through the jungle with assault rifles at the ready. They were engaged in a different kind of work, far from running around. First and foremost, they organized an effective air defense system for the Vietnamese. Moreover, at first, it was the Soviet military specialists who were shooting down American planes. And by 1966, 10 anti-aircraft missile regiments and 3 radio-technical service regiments had been trained from the locals. In this regard, it's interesting to look into the history of the legendary song Phantom, which became a folk song even before it started being performed by popular groups, including the rock band Chij, with their version, which became the canonical one. Originally, the song called My Phantom was written in 1966 by first-year cadets of the Armavir Higher Military Aviation School of Air Defense Pilots. There are such lines there.
The pilot who shot me down? One's Vietnamese, I asked. The slant-eyed one who was in charge of the interrogation answered me, "Was it our pilot, Lisitsin, who shot you down?"
Was it really so? As for the last name, it's all simple here. This is a reference to an earlier conflict, the Korean War. Ivan Nikitovich Kozhedub also joked that he fought in Korea under the name Lisi Chin, but in reality, Kozhedub's pseudonym was Krylov, and this joke had been circulating since the late 1930s. At that time, Soviet pilots really did fight on the side of the Chinese People's Liberation Army against Japanese forces under names like Vanyushin, Li Si-chin, Li, Si, Chin-hu, and Ben-ho. Gubenko. As for the spectacular scenes from the Top Gun movies, specifically the aerial dogfights, well, the Ministry of Defense of Vietnam still hasn't declassified the archives from after 1960, and we'll have to wait many more years for that moment. The only information available today about Soviet losses is a list of 9 pilots who died in Vietnam. United States sources provide a more detailed picture in which air battles are documented, at least for the operations that were successful for the United States. For example, the operation codenamed Bolo. The essence of the operation was that Fe-4 fighters had to imitate the behavior of an aviation group consisting of F-105, which were considered easier prey for the MiGs. Thus, the Vietnamese MiGs were supposed to fall into the trap. We have to give credit to the Americans. On January 2, 1967, their plan worked. MiG-21As were scrambled for an air intercept, and the Phantom pilots, using their numerical superiority and the element of surprise, engaged them in an air battle. According to the United States Air Force, exactly 7 fighters of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam were shot down. This air battle is considered one of the largest of the entire war. It is believed that the pilots in the MiGs were Vietnamese, since Soviet aces officially held positions as advisors and instructors. But there is also an unusual fact. United States pilots were still able to identify Soviet pilots in Vietnam within a few seconds. Soviet pilots were given away by just one trait. Vietnamese fighters, accustomed to guerrilla warfare, were perplexed by the control panels of air defense systems and modern fighter jets. It was because of their thin build. At that time, the average Vietnamese person was the size of a slim European or American teenager of 12 or 13 years old. Because of this thinness, Vietnamese pilots had difficulty withstanding the G-forces that were inevitable in a fighter cockpit. Intensive nutrition combined with long training sessions did not bring any decisive changes to this situation. They just couldn't withstand the G-forces, that's all. American pilots quickly understood the difference and learned to tell whether it was a Viet Cong or a Russian at the controls of the enemy aircraft. If, during a sharp maneuver with heavy G-forces, the plane's wingtips started to shake and the pilot hesitated for a second or lost consciousness, it meant there was a Vietnamese in the cockpit. But if the fighter continues to confidently perform the maneuver, it means you're facing an experienced Soviet pilot. Ice, and the outcome of a battle with him is completely unpredictable. He can break away from the line of attack with a wild overload, or, in the best traditions of Top Gun, at the very limit of the aircraft's capabilities, he himself can end up on the attacker's tail. That's why American pilots preferred not to engage in dogfights with their Soviet counterparts, and, whenever possible, tried to avoid them. But in reality, air duels, despite their heroic beauty, spectacle, and the popularity of movies with Tom Cruise, did not play a decisive role in the skies over Vietnam. For the United States, it was the thunderous roar that was decisive. The code name for the bombings of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam by American aviation during the Vietnam War. The operation was conducted from 1965 for almost 5 years and is considered the longest bombing campaign after the end of World War II. On the side of the Soviet Union, the 64th Fighter Air Corps took part in the combat operations in Vietnam, which included both aviation and anti-aircraft units. Approximate statistics of air battles regarding enemy aircraft shot down are as follows. Fighter aviation shot down about 300, SAM 2,000 systems about 1,000, and anti-aircraft artillery about 2,000. During the entire period of the war in Vietnam, about 1,300 combat sorties were carried out on MiG-21 aircraft, and losses were the lowest compared to aircraft of other types. But it should be said that, unfortunately, Vietnamese pilots did suffer losses, including from friendly fire from their own air defense systems. So, in the period from 1966 to 1968, the Vietnamese shot down 6 of their own MiG-21 fighter jets. In December 1972, during the repulsion of a massive raid on Hanoi, a missile division managed to shoot down 31 B-52 bombers. This became one of the most significant blows for the Americans. After that, they decided to sign an agreement in Paris to cease the bombing of Vietnam and withdraw their troops under the conditions set by the Vietnamese side. If we sum all this up, we can note the following. In fact, Soviet military specialists essentially created a modern army for the Vietnamese, equipped with tanks, aviation, and anti-aircraft artillery. This type of assistance led to the United States Army's withdrawal from Vietnam, and a few years later, the fall of South Vietnam. Write how you feel about all this. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next episodes on our channel.